What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we are going to be exposing the historical misrepresentations of Mike Licona concerning the authorship of the Gospels. Mike considers the Gospels to be authored by those mentioned in the titles. We will find out that this is in fact not true. Additionally, he claims that all ancient biographies are anonymous just like the Gospels are anonymous. This is also false. Everything that Mike Licona and Gary Habermas claim are indeed false. If you want to know how wrong Mike Licona and Gary Habermas are, then please stay tuned. Now, before we begin this video, I feel the need to lay out a few core facts. One of those facts being that the Gospels were definitely written anonymously, and this is the consensus of the scholars in the field. Now, I'm not saying this to commit an appeal to authority fallacy, which is when you only cite the authorities in order to establish something as being true. Personally, I feel that New Testament scholarship is near intellectually bankrupt, especially when it comes to the harder questions of Christianity. Questions like, did Jesus exist? Was Jesus divine? And did a Jew resurrect from the dead in the first century? They would answer yes to all three questions using the same kinds of arguments for all of them. Today, we're going to examine how Mike Licona embodies the intellectual bankruptcy of New Testament scholarship. Now, I could be a complete douche canoe and claim that Habermas and Licona are being intentionally deceptive here. I could be an absolute cockwomble about that, but that would be assigning motive and intent to them. Personally, I don't want to fuck around and find out how shitty it is to do that. Also, I kind of feel like that's already been done recently. This first clip is going to demonstrate how bad of a historian Gary Habermas is.
So, of course, we can't bring back that event, and not knowing or not observing that situation. There's no way to test that to see if it was true.
Well, not only
agree with that.
But the only evidence for the resurrection of Jesus are in the Gospels.
Well, first of all, that's not true. It's just not true. Flat out not true. I've already cited the Gospel of the Hebrews from about 125 AD. You go, well, hey, that's you fundamentalists. When you get something outside the Bible, you like it, you go for it. And again, I said, tell Dom Crossan you think he's stupid. A famous New Testament skeptic. Tell that to Bart. I don't know what he'd say about that. Tell that to Darrell Bach, an evangelical New Testament scholar, when he writes about this book. But there's others. Clement of Rome, about 95 AD. Ignatius, about 107 AD. Polycarp, 110 AD. Ignatius, for example, says, 7 years after the close of the New Testament canon, Ignatius says, when Jesus said, touch me, Ignatius said, they reached out and held on to him. You can say, I don't accept that. That's fine. But don't say there are no sources from that early time that affirm this. That's because you've whisked them under the carpet. Then you go, no story here. And I just object to that kind of scholarship or lack thereof.
In that clip, Matt was only factually stating that the only independent sources we have for the resurrection are the Gospels. Really, all the Gospels should just be lumped into one source, because all of the Gospels are based on the first Gospel, Mark. They are definitely not four independent accounts of Jesus' life. They are just one fictional account. Even amateur historians would understand that if you have two sources for something, but one of those sources is either based on or influenced by the other source, then you really only have one source. Apparently, Gary Habermas doesn't understand this very basic concept in historical research, because he goes on to list a whole bunch of sources that are likewise informed by either the Gospels or just the general knowledge of the Christian community. Also, most, if not all, of what he cited was in the 2nd century. And the Christian doctrine about Jesus and what he supposedly did in his life was well established in the community by this time. Also, his initial diatribe about how you should go and tell John Dominic Crossan he's stupid, and then listing off a whole bunch of other scholars that people should go and tell off, was just really childish. First, I don't really care what the intellectually bankrupt New Testament scholars have to say about Jesus' resurrection. Second, I like how he brought up Bart Ehrman as if that was supposed to help him in any kind of way. For the resurrection, Ehrman only ever focuses on the Gospels because those are our only accounts of his resurrection. Ehrman also states that they are not historically reliable. Finally, Gary Habermas objects to this kind of evidence because it proves that the evidence that they have is shoddy at best. Next, we're going to get to Licona claiming that all ancient biographies are anonymous, and he does it in a very deceptive way.
To say that the Gospels are anonymous is a card that is it's overplayed big time. When it is true, I believe it's true that the Gospels in the autographs, in the original form, were probably anonymous. They probably did not contain the titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark. I think those were probably added later, maybe in the 2nd century. But it's overplayed, and here's why. When you take all the biographies that were written in that period, and over 100 of them, okay, in that period. If you just look at 150 years on each side of Jesus, this 300-year period, about any biography written about anyone, you have about 90. Okay, but if you extend it even way past that, you've got over 100. Okay, all of them are anonymous, with only 2 exceptions. You have the passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata in the middle of the 2nd century, and then you have the life of Elias in the Historia Augusta, written at the end of the 4th century. That's about a half a century after the Council of Nicaea. That's how late that is. Those are the only 2 that contain the author's name in it. The rest of them are anonymous.
This is exactly opposite of reality. The only anonymous works, biographies or not, were fictional. Like the Gospels. He mentions the death of Peregrinus as a biography, but in fact it's an essay. So he's wrong there. The Historia Augusta is half fake, with most if not all of the authors assigned to the chapters being fake as well. But this also bites Licona in the ass because the Historia Augusta was crafted by whoever to look like ancient biographies. Meaning that the chapters had people claiming to be authors within the manuscript. Mike's claim here is that the Gospels didn't originally have titles, and because the works don't mention the authors within it, that makes them anonymous. Which I'm with him on, but then he manipulates other ancient biographies to remove the author's name and then proclaim them to be just as anonymous as the Gospels. Just watch him do it.
Biographies aren't the only thing. You take the writings of Livy, one of the great Roman historians. It's anonymous.
All extant manuscripts of Livy's writings have Livy claiming authorship. Mike thinks that by removing the author claiming authorship, that makes them anonymous. That's not how any of this works, Mike. It just makes you look deceptive.
You can take the writings of Sallust, whom the famous Roman rhetorician Quintilian said was a better historian than Livy, and that you had to be advanced in your studies to appreciate him properly. All of Sallust's writings are anonymous.
And the same with Sallust. He removes the part where the author claims authorship, which is extant in all of our manuscripts, and then presents it as anonymous.
Caesar's commentary on the Civil War. They're not only anonymous, Caesar wrote them, but it's anonymous, and it's written entirely in the 3rd person, much like the Gospel of John is.
This is not true either. All existing manuscripts start with Gaius Caesar claiming authorship. Again, he removes something that has always been part of the manuscript in order to force it to be anonymous.
Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer by classicists today. He wrote over 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. None of them have Plutarch's name in the preface, in the proem, or the title, the preface, the proem, or anywhere throughout them. They're anonymous in the same sense the Gospels are.
Yet again, Mike ignores the fact that Plutarch's biographies start with Plutarch claiming authorship. If you continue to just remove the author's claim of authorship from any work out there, then every single thing ever written is anonymous. All of Mike's books are written anonymously. If you remove any indication that Mike wrote the book. Mike's just being really ridiculous at this point, and he shows what little value he has as a historian.
We have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, it's not unimpeachable by any means, but the evidence we have for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the traditional authors is superior to the evidence we have that Plutarch wrote those lives, the biographies attributed to him. And yet you'd be hard-pressed to find a classicist today who questions whether Plutarch wrote those.
Oh man, well, you would be hard-pressed to find any classicist that would doubt that Plutarch wrote his biographies, mainly because Plutarch's name is on the fucking manuscripts! Considering that the Gospels didn't originally have any authorship claims, they simply cannot have superior evidence for their authorship than the author's name being directly on the manuscript. In fact, the way that the Gospels are titled indicates sources, not authorship. The Greek word kata used in the titles is a dead giveaway for this. But let's take a look at what the evidence is for the authorship of the Gospels that he's talking about. The earliest known indication of who wrote at least some of the Gospels is Papias. Papias was writing between 110 and 140 CE. Papias also notoriously reported third and fourth hand information that weren't true. He talks about a group called the Elders that appear nowhere else in history. He claims that these elders communicated to him that John Mark wrote Mark. And then separately, without any indication as to how he came about this information, he claims that Matthew Levi wrote Matthew. Although the Matthew that Papias talks about is not our Matthew. Papias claimed that Matthew's gospel was just a collection of Jesus' sayings, but that's not what our Matthew is. He also claimed that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, which it wasn't. It was written in Greek. As for Mark, he tells us that John Mark wrote down everything that Peter said about Jesus, but considering that Mark's the short gospel and only takes about 2 hours to read aloud, it seems like this wouldn't be everything that Peter said about Jesus. Another thing to consider is that everything that Papias records is rejected by the same consensus that Mike and Gary rely on. For instance, one thing that Papias records is that after betraying Jesus, Judas bloated to the width of a street and then exploded. Obviously, the one true thing that Papias wrote about was the authorship of Mark and Matthew, that he either completely made up or he got from these mysterious elders that nobody hears about elsewhere. Now, moving off of Papias, the first time that we get a full list of Gospels comes from Irenaeus in 180 CE. Obviously, by the end of the 2nd century, there would be no way to tell if these claims were true or not. What it does indicate is that by this time in Christian history, having historically grounded Gospels of Jesus was important to the Christian community. Since the Gospels were originally anonymous, they just made up authors that seemed like they would be historically connected to Jesus. Another thing to consider is that none of the Gospels read as if they were eyewitness accounts, nor do they even claim to be eyewitness accounts. Both of the Gospels, supposedly written by Jesus' disciples, Matthew and John, do not indicate that they were eyewitnesses when they should have if they wrote them. Matthew's gospel speaks in the third person, which is not how you would normally write an eyewitness account. The Gospel of John blatantly says at the very end of the gospel that the beloved disciple was the source of the information, not the author. Also, how could both of these Gospels really be talking about the same guy? They are radically different in many ways. I mean, Matthew has Jesus being born of a virgin, while John has Jesus pre-existing the universe, and even being used to create the universe. Matthew doesn't have Jesus claiming to be God, but in John, that is Jesus' primary message. In Matthew, Jesus refuses to do miracles to prove his identity, but in John, That seems to be the primary way that Jesus proves his identity. They are just so radically different that it's hard to say that these are just two different perspectives of the same events. Additionally, it's quite ridiculous to think that anybody close to Jesus would have written any gospel. The Gospels are written in a sophisticated Greek. Whoever wrote the Gospels were not poor, illiterate, Aramaic-speaking peasant people in the first century, which is who the disciples and anybody connected to Jesus would have been. Only about 10% of the Roman population were literate. This 10% would have been upper-class citizens who could afford to learn to read and write, which were considered two different skills at the time. When pressed on the issue of defending the authorship of Mark's Gospel, Mike Licona responds by just appealing to authority.
At HBU, I've got some really sharp grad students there, and one was a guy named Joshua Pelletier. And so I supervised his MA thesis, and he did it on where critical scholars stand on some prolegomena related to Mark. Who wrote Mark? When was it written? And the third one, does it go back to Petrine tradition? Does it go back to the Apostle Peter, that he was the eyewitness that passed along the information to Mark? And so he surveyed more than 200 critical New Testament scholars writing since 1965 in English, okay? So he didn't look at German scholars because he doesn't read German. He didn't look at French or any other, but over 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965 up to the present. And he found that the majority of them who comment on this think that Mark is the author of Gospel of Mark, and that his primary source was the Apostle Peter. And they also think that Mark wrote somewhere between the years 50 and 70. And you can narrow that further to between 65 and 70, the years 65 and 70. But the majority of those critical scholars who are discussing it in writing, in academic writings, are saying that Mark is the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct.
So instead of giving us any real evidence or arguments for John Mark being the author of Mark, he just appeals to authority? I know what you're furiously typing in the comments right now. Appeal to authority isn't a fallacy! Well, sorry to burst your bubble, but it's very fallacious. Authorities can be wrong and or based on bad information that makes them wrong. The intellectual bankruptcy of New Testament scholarship is evident by the circular logic demonstrated by their use of authorities. The authorities validate the authorities on answers to questions like who wrote the Gospels and did Jesus exist? Now, personally, I don't care what New Testament scholars have said about the authorship of the Gospels, but you are wrong about the majority of scholars in your field. The majority of scholars do not hold Mike's position, and while that really doesn't matter to me, it should matter to both Mike and Gary, who rely on the authorities to validate their answers to these questions. Especially considering that they both use the authorities in order to validate that Jesus existed in history. And especially Gary, because he has that minimal facts approach to Jesus' resurrection in which he relies on the consensus of authorities in order to support his conclusion. Now, I get it. You probably want to hear this stuff from somebody who's got degrees in a field that would be directly related to the subject that we're talking about. In that case, I will present to you Bart Ehrman. Here's Bart in a debate with William Lane Craig in 2006 where he tells you the exact same thing.
Bill makes dubious use of modern authorities. Bill constantly quotes modern scholars as if somehow that constitutes evidence for his point of view. As Bill himself knows, the fact that the majority of New Testament scholars would agree with his 4 points is not proof that they are right. For one thing, the majority of New Testament scholars are believers in the New Testament. That is, they're theologically committed to the text. So of course they agree on these points. I should note that the majority of historians do not agree with Bill's conclusions. Does that make those conclusions wrong? No, it simply means that his conclusions are not persuasive to most historians.
By the way, all of that applies to Jesus' historicity too. Just because all of the theologically committed authorities think that Jesus existed does not mean that he really existed. Well, that's going to be it for the analysis today. Mike Licona has been using this all ancient biographies are anonymous shtick for a while now. I think it's sad how people just accept that he's correct about this and then walk away with this false information. Mike Licona is not a historian, but he presents himself as one. I would think that until Mike does a bit better with his historiography, people shouldn't take his word as the gospel truth. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you think about Mike Licona misrepresenting ancient biographies and claiming that they are just as anonymous as the gospels are. Let me know what you think down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.